Welcome to South Central Regional Library's Safe Inside Your Walls programming, supported by Safe at Home Manitoba. Hi, my name is Linda and I'm a librarian. Today I'm going to show you how I make upcycled sweater mitts. You may have seen that classic shot of Bernie Sanders at the inauguration in January of this year, sweater mitts to the fore. We're a little bit late popping on the bandwagon, but here's how I'd make them. You will need an old sweater. The higher the percentage of wool, the better. If your thrifted sweater has wool in it, 40% or more, you can put it into a pillowcase and safety pin it shut, and then put it through the washing machine and dryer on high, 2 or 3 times if needed, to felt the sweater. This will mat the wool together like felt, so it doesn't unravel when it's cut. This step is optional. You will also need a fleece, a polar fleece, a sweatshirt, or a flannel shirt. You'll need fabric scissors, pins, and a hand sewing needle, and thread. Sewing machine, sort of optional. Embroidery floss, definitely optional. In fact, it's so optional that this is the last time you'll see it in this video. And buttons, optional. You will also need a pattern. And for that, you'll need 1 to 2 sheets of paper and possibly tape, a pencil, that pair of paper scissors you dropped a minute ago, don't use fabric scissors, a ruler, pencil crayons if you like colored lines, and you'll need a mitten that fits you. If you don't have a mitten that fits you, you can use your hand. So let's start with the mitten method. Check to make sure that the mitten fits the way you want it to fit. Then flatten it out on the paper so that the thumb is folded in half equally. Make sure there's about an equal amount of space on the side, the little finger side of the mitten and the tip of the thumb. Now trace around the outside of the mitten. Skip the thumb for the moment, but get right down into the pit there. And then pull the thumb, swing the thumb out and flatten it a bit so that you have some space to work in between the thumb and the palm, and trace around the thumb as well. This is your seam line. When you're sewing your pieces together, that's the line you'll follow. However, you need seam allowance. In this case, I'm suggesting 1/2 inch. I should be doing it in centimeters, which would be somewhere between 1.25 and 1.3 centimeters. But my sewing machine is old and it's imperial, and so were the first couple of people who taught me how to sew. My apologies. Anyway, measure 1/2 inch from your stitch line at a bunch of different points, and then connect them together. The seam allowance is to give you some space to sew into, to make mistakes, and to give you some fabric so that it doesn't fray away and the stitches come loose. If you felted your sweater, you won't need as much seam allowance. If you pick at the cut edge of your fabric and it stays solid, you can trim it closer as well, but if it comes apart, leave yourself a little bit more. Polar fleece doesn't fray, sweatshirt knit or flannel will. And now, cut it out on your cut line or your seam allowance line. Voila, pattern. But if you don't have a mitten, you can make your own pattern. Start with a sheet of paper or 2, tape them together if you need to, and put your hand on it, little finger side, about an inch, 1.5 inches away from the edge. Trace around your hand from bottom corner all the way around the fingers and the thumb. Make sure you keep your thumb out so that you have space to work between the thumb and fingers. And all the way around the thumb and down to the bottom corner. Now, using a ruler, find the widest point of your hand on the little finger side and draw lines straight down from that point to the edge of the paper and up to the top of your little finger level. Then you do the same thing for the furthest point out on the other side of your hand. Use something round to trace around, like a mug or a glass, but I've got this roll of tape here and the mugs are in the kitchen. But you use that to draw a semicircle around the tops of the fingers from one of the lines you drew to the other. You're going from the point just below the tip of the little finger to that same level on the other side of the hand. It doesn't have to be a half circle as long as the arc goes higher than your middle finger. You might have to do a little bit of fudging to match the edge on one corner or the other. So there's your base shape. Now, this would be fine if your hand was as flat as a sheet of paper, but since it's not, you'll have to measure out from that line by about the width of your thumb joint to give it space. Mark out the points and then join the lines. This is going to be your stitch line. Trace over that line to reinforce it with colors if you're feeling fancy, just like you did the other time. And now you repeat the process to add your ½ inch seam allowance. Yes, I could have measured both points off at once, but I didn't. It gets really confusing in the space between the thumb and the fingers, even when you're working with just one set of points, never mind two. So now you have your stitch line and your seam allowance line cut out around your seam allowance line, and there you have your pattern. Next, lay out your sweater. You'll need to cut out 4 of your mitten pattern, 2 on the right side and 2 on the wrong side. Or my preferred method is to cut out 2 on the fold. Fold your sweater in half at the side seam and smooth it out so the bottom edges line up, the fold is right on the seam, and there are no wrinkles. Now place your pattern piece so that the bottom of your hand sits at the point where the ribbon begins. The rib should be at least 3 fingers wide. If it isn't, move the pattern piece up a bit. Make sure you set your pattern with your stitch line, not the seam allowance line, on the side seam of the sweater or on a fold. And then you can cut out 2 joined pieces. Make sure you pin it in place. That thumb can be a bit floppy. So you're not going to need the seam allowance on the little finger side of the hand because that's already been joined for you. But if you're not cutting on the folded seam or on a fold in general, you will need to have that seam allowance. Now, cut out 4 pieces or 2 joined pieces out of your fleece piece, whether that's polar fleece, sweatshirt, or flannel shirt. Place your pattern piece on the fold if you can, but if not, flat is fine too. Just make sure you leave enough space for rib. You can use the hem edge of your item, the hem, or the ribbing, to be the wrist edge of your pieces as long as the seam isn't too bulky. Just be aware that most home sewing machines don't like sewing through more than 4 layers, so you'll probably end up having to sew that part of the seam by hand. The wrist section of your inner mitt should be slightly shorter than your outer mitt, or for a contrast cuff, which I'm about to show here, move the pattern piece up so the cuff is twice as long as your sweater piece cuff, plus hem or seam allowance. You'll fold it around later. So here I have a cut open sleeve part and I'm checking to see if I have enough space. So fold it in half, right sides together, and now you can see me making a mistake. Take the pattern piece, and then I take the pattern away and I use a pre-cut piece. I didn't place my pattern piece correctly and I'm leaving seam allowance on the little finger side, so now I've got an inch more space on that than I need. This could be a problem later. Now, pin the sweater pieces together with the right sides, the sides that you want on the outside, facing each other. Match the bottom corner of the cuff at the thumb and at the top curve. Pin each in place as you go. It may take a bit of fiddling to get it close. And through the magic of editing, all 4 pieces, 2 inner and 2 outer mitts, are pinned. And now sew them together. Use a zigzag stitch setting on your machine with a longer stitch length and a narrower zig or zag. This will let your fabric stretch a little without breaking the thread. Line up the cut edge of your fabric with a 1/2 inch or equivalent sewing guide on your machine. Start by backstitching a few stitches to secure the thread, then sew your seam. Go as slow as you need to. Stop as often as you like. When you come to a sharp corner, like the thumb, stop, bring the needle down so it's sunk into the fabric, then lift the presser foot, turn the fabric so everything's pointed in the right direction, put down the presser foot, and continue. When you get to the end of your seam, backstitch and cut your threads. Once you've finished sewing, clip into the seam allowance at the top of the curve and at the inside of the thumb joint. Clip a notch, almost but not quite, down to the seam line, but don't cut through your stitches. I'm also trimming back the seam allowance over the thumb. I'm not too worried about this fabric fraying a lot, but I am also going to reinforce it. If you don't trim out that seam allowance, there will be a lot of bulk inside that thumb area. You can finish your seam edges to prevent fraying by running another line of zigzag stitch right along the cut edge, or you can overcast stitch it, and that's what I'm doing here. Did I mention that I like using polar fleece or Arctic fleece for this because it doesn't fray at all and you don't need to finish the edges? Anyway, stitch in from one side, loop over, and then stitch in from that side again. Overcasting, pulling it tight, it helps protect the edge. Turn the outer mittens inside out. I find it's easier sometimes to get the thumb and then the hand portion. Then take that off and put on the fleece mitten, which is still wrong side out. Now pull the sweater mitten over top. You'll need to fiddle with this a bit to get it all to lie smooth and for all the seams to line up. Hand stitch through the seam and make sure you get both layers to tack them together at the top of the mitten and at the tip of the thumb so they don't move. Sew the mitts together close to the bottom edges. I recommend doing this by hand, usually right at the base of the ribbing. For a combination of speed and security, you can use what's called a running back stitch. Come up just a little further along than you want the seam line to start, about a stitch width. Go down through the beginning of the seam line, come back up through the place you originally did, and then weave your needle through the fabric down, up, for 3 or 4 stitches. Now go back 1 stitch and down, come up again where you left off, and weave again for 3 or 4 stitches, down, up, down, up, down, up. Keep going like that all the way around. Now if you want to completely hand sew these mitts, which is perfectly fine, you can sew the seam with the running back stitch as well. I have seen people recommend using embroidery floss for sewing it together. It works. So does thread. Your call. I have not forgotten about the contrast cuff version. For this one, I wouldn't bother sewing the bottoms together. So here we have inner mitt inside the outer mitt. The bottom is sticking out. Fold the bottom edge up and over the outer mitt's cuff and get it settled in place. As always, a little bit of futzing is required to get it to sit right. If you haven't already hand sewed the bottom of that hem, you can do that now. Then tack it in place with a few stitches here and there. This cuff is a great place to decorate with a button or possibly with more of that embroidery floss. And that's how I make sweater mittens. Thank you for joining us for this Safe at Home Manitoba production. Stay safe inside your walls.